You're listening to a Liberty.me podcast. Find us on iTunes or Stitcher and visit Liberty.me to start your free trial today. Liberty lives here.
Well, here it is, the early fall of 2014, and the debate within the libertarian movement over thick versus thin libertarianism and brutalist versus humanitarian libertarianism seems to have largely abated. There is, however, at least one salient point about these controversies that has yet to be pointed out and stressed in the manner I believe is fitting. It is a point about specialization and division of labor, two topics about which one would hope it would be unnecessary to lecture libertarians. Yet here I am, lecturing them. Let me begin by quoting from a few comments libertarians have recently chosen to post on Facebook in regard to the thick versus thin controversy. One California libertarian, an old-timer like me, a person who was involved in Libertarian Party activism when I first became aware of her existence more than 40 years ago, and is still involved in such activism today, recently wrote that, "I think talking about thick or thin, pure or not, will only confuse the public we hope to educate towards less government in our society. Successful politicians keep it simple. We must do the same. It is way past time for our argument about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin to end. That is, if we want to successfully change the mindset of statists." Later the same day, in a long Facebook thread devoted to the thick and thin of libertarianism, this longtime activist re-emphasized this point. "Does discussing thick and thin sell liberty to the masses?" she asked rhetorically. Then she answered her own question with a definite no. In her words, esoteric intellectualizing will not change the hearts and minds of the voters in America one iota. It may be fun for us here on Facebook, but then I spend less time working on an election campaign, something she clearly regards as a more useful and defensible activity for libertarians to engage in than arguing about the thick and thin issue. And yet, isn't it obvious that not all of us libertarian writers and commentators are addressing the public? That not all of us are in the business of selling liberty to the masses? I'm certainly not. I'm in the business of offering those who have already at least tentatively chosen libertarianism a broader acquaintance with it and with what has been written and said about it in the past, including, in the form of reviews of current books, the very recent past. Others direct their main writing to the general public and write on the side, as it were, for an audience of those who have already in some sense joined the movement. Anthony Gregory, Sheldon Richman, until very recently, Kathy Reisenwitz. I think the confusion I'm talking about here is based on a failure to grasp the difference between what Murray Rothbard called ideological outreach and what he called internal education. Rothbard employed these terms in a work he entitled Toward a Theory of Libertarian Social Change, which Justin Raimondo, in his masterful biography of Rothbard, An Enemy of the State, describes as a book-length memo on strategy written in the mid-'70s, meant only for the inner circle of the Libertarian Cato Institute, and never published. Actually, an excerpt from this memorandum has seen print as the closing chapter, Toward a Theory of Strategy for Liberty, in Rothbard's book, The Ethics of Liberty. But the section of Rothbard's memo that I want to discuss in this podcast has not been published. Back in the mid-1970s, when Rothbard wrote it, I was a member of the inner circle of the Cato Institute, and I read it in manuscript shortly after Rothbard wrote it. My comments on it over the next few minutes are based on my memory of reading it in manuscript 40 years ago. Rothbard contended that a successful libertarian movement would need the services of two distinct kinds of intellectuals. One set of intellectuals would engage in ideological outreach. They would write for the general public and would focus their efforts on converting liberals and conservatives to a more libertarian point of view. Another set of intellectuals would focus on readers who were already in the libertarian movement. These intellectuals would engage in internal education. They would work to make people who were already libertarians ever more radical, ever more hardcore, as Samuel Edward Konkin III called it. Borrowing a term from the pornography, he earned his living for many years by typesetting. It was under the influence of this aspect of Rothbard's vision of libertarian social change that the original Coctopus, another Sam Konkin term, describing the set of interconnected libertarian institutions funded by Charles and David Koch in the 1970s, supported two libertarian magazines: Inquiry, a fortnightly outreach magazine published by the Cato Institute and aimed at converting liberal readers to a more libertarian position, and The Libertarian Review, edited by Roy A. Childs, Jr., a monthly magazine aimed at readers already in the libertarian movement. If the thick versus thin debate had been raging then, it would have been ignored by Inquiry, but covered enthusiastically by the Libertarian Review. Some contemporary libertarians, though they may not know all this movement history I've just sketched for you, do realize that there is a kind of specialization and division of labor among libertarian intellectuals, and that both ideological outreach and internal education are worthwhile activities. But they believe the two ought to be segregated in early Coctopus style, in separate publications. Thus, one libertarian commented recently on Facebook that if there should be two groups of libertarian intellectuals, then the group doing the internal discussions should be doing them internally, not in a public forum that creates confusion among fellow travelers and potential fellow travelers. Another libertarian chimed in later the same day on the same thread, a thread devoted primarily to the thick versus thin controversy, that if libertarianism is to become a mass movement, it'll have to be understood by a critical mass. Forums like Facebook are not for the hardcore who enjoy spending endless hours splitting hairs about endlessly more complicated and rarefied libertarian theory. The masses coming to a forum like this, I am very sure, will either ignore most of you here or distrust you as yet another silver-tongued cadre of ideologues doing a song and dance before they snare you into yet another horrifying utopia. I think these views are mistaken, and I believe I can explain why I think that most clearly by using an analogy. Consider the world of science fiction. Many science fiction writers, during the years their careers have spanned, have also published a good deal of what is known in the science fiction world as fan writing, writing for an audience already interested in science fiction and in search of further education, further understanding, writing about the history of science fiction, the important works of science fiction from before the 20th century, the use of science fiction stories as the basis for narrative films, the merits of current science fiction novels and story collections, and so on. This fan writing is usually, though not always, published in small circulation periodicals known as fanzines. Often enough, they are published in the pages of popular science fiction magazines like Analog, Galaxy, and the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, where newcomers to the science fiction world, and even members of the general public, might be expected now and then to stray. But even if their fan articles are first published in the pages of only such journals of small readership where the general public is unlikely to be found, even then, such articles are not infrequently gathered together for publication in books that are indiscriminately available to the seasoned science fiction fan, the newcomer to the science fiction world, and the general public. Do people in the science fiction world get all bent out of shape because, what if a member of the general public, a person who just wants to find out what science fiction is, what if such a person were to read this piece on how much the cyberpunks owe to Alfred Bester, or this other piece on whether anyone today is still writing the kind of hard science fiction we associate with John W. Campbell, or this other piece on why the so-called new wave science fiction of the 1960s and 70s shouldn't be considered science fiction at all? Would that person not become confused and decide the subject of science fiction is just not worth looking into at all, because the people who are already into it clearly can't even agree among themselves about what it is or isn't? How does this expand the audience for science fiction among the general public? No, the people who make up the world of science fiction do not react in this way. They figure, I guess, that spontaneous order will sort it all out in the end, because really there isn't any other way to sort it out. We can't prevent anyone who wants to read an article or a Facebook thread from doing so. We can't control who reads what, nor should we want to. By the same token, we cannot prevent people from writing or saying what they want via whatever media they prefer. Nor should we want to prevent such activities, or even to try to dissuade people from engaging in them. Think about it. How could we? Should we have websites you can get into only after scoring a certain minimum on a test of familiarity with libertarian arcana? Not everybody who visits Mises.org on any given day is the kind of reader or listener I had in mind when I wrote and recorded my Libertarian Tradition podcasts during 2010 and 2011. I ran the risk, so to speak, that readers I didn't have in mind when I wrote those podcasts might listen to them anyway. How could I have prevented them from doing so? The question is really too ridiculous to waste any further time on. But in case there's any remaining doubt in any of my listeners' minds that internal education, including vigorous debate about thick versus thin or humanitarian versus brutalist, in case there's any remaining doubt that these and many other issues are worth talking about and writing about for people who are already libertarians in some sense and to some extent, bear with me while I cite a few examples that have special importance for me. A long time ago, in the late 1970s, when I was working as an editor at the Libertarian Review, I invented a totally fictitious organization called Libertarians for Force and Fraud, or LFF. I conceived LFF after reading some of the literature of a real organization, a libertarian anti-abortion group called Libertarians for Life. Around 25 years later, I mentioned my fictitious organization to my young friend Anthony Gregory, whom I had only recently met during his senior year as an undergraduate history major at the University of California at Berkeley. I suggested to him that the two of us might put together a satirical website for LFF. He became very enthusiastic about the idea and wrote some very clever copy for the proposed website. But the project never got beyond the planning stages, for reasons that were entirely my own fault. I was somewhat younger then than I am now, but I was old enough to be considerably less energetic than Anthony, and I just never got around to doing my part of what needed to be done. We did talk about the idea to various other libertarians, including Walter Block and the libertarian psychologist Michael Edelstein, both of whom loved the idea, and the notorious Libertarian Party activist Starchild, who did not love the idea. Starchild told us that libertarians did not need a site like that because we already had a serious problem with people taking unlibertarian positions and calling them libertarian. He was afraid too many of our readers wouldn't realize we were kidding. And, of course, he was right. Right there in San Francisco, we had an attorney active in the local LP who favored rent control and gun control. Starchild himself approved of Bill Clinton's decision to bomb Serbia. This is precisely the reason internal education is important. Another example. It is impossible to read Facebook these days without running across mostly younger libertarians who emphatically deny that they are feminists, or that it is even possible for a libertarian to be a feminist without self-contradiction. Does no one read Joan Kennedy Taylor any longer? This is why I wrote my new book, Persuaded by Reason, about her life and work, and how both fit into and exemplify the more than century-old tradition of American individualism. This is why we need internal education. Earlier this month, Anthony Gregory posted an extraordinary statement on Facebook that I think is worth quoting in full. "I'm having trouble understanding," he wrote, "why so many ideologically driven folks seem really not to want to understand the beliefs that other people hold. It would appear to me that if you have confidence in your own beliefs, you would wish to spread those beliefs effectively, and a refined comprehension of the complexities of opposing opinions would thus suit you well. It would also serve to bolster that ideological confidence to consider your own ideas in light of a thorough recognition of the alternatives. And, on the other hand, if you don't have confidence in your own perspective, would it not also benefit you to try to apprehend the contours of what other people think, so as to either give more support to what you believe, or to challenge it more effectively toward the development and possibly the adaptation of your own ideas so they better correspond to reality, or obtain greater consistency, or otherwise qualify as beliefs more worthy of your confidence?" Anthony continued, "This is not mere rhetoric. I want to know why it is people don't want to understand what other people think. Do people simply hold doubts in their views, and they don't want them challenged by an opposing approach, and so they would rather caricature such opposing ideas than recognize the sophistication and seriousness these different ideas might possess? That would seem to explain it. But such an explanation delves into psychology, of which I know close to nothing. I believe," Anthony concluded, "we should not only aspire to pass the ideological Turing test, but also to become so adept at understanding opposing viewpoints that we could pass an even more rigorous test, one that would demonstrate a person's ability not only to fully emulate the views of intellectual opponents, but to help those opponents refine and understand their own views better." That was Anthony Gregory with perhaps a more eloquent explanation of the need for internal education in the libertarian movement than any I could come up with myself. And this is Jeff Riggenbach.
This has been a production of Liberty.me. Join us and start your free trial today. The views expressed on this broadcast are not necessarily those of Liberty.me.